I am going to speak about similar legal problems, but I think maybe on a little bit of a more idealistic level, which I apologize for, but I think that as academics we have to somehow allow ourselves to also try and approach those idealistic spheres. I am looking in my paper at how the authority over economic governance in Europe is affected by the regulatory responses to crisis, and as we have been discussing since yesterday, plenty of those regulatory responses have been developed outside the normalcy as we had known that. And Bruno Dvite, in his introductory panel yesterday, has basically set out the scene for me, and my two colleagues on the panel have filled in with more details, so half of my work is done here. Bruno characterized 3 of those intergovernmental instruments, and what he concluded is that he cannot treat them as a tendency because of lack of strategic intergovernmental plot that would link them and so show a common direction. So they were more seen as separate and incidental. And in fact, this is exactly what worries me. It's not so much the tendency towards intergovernmentalism, which we can argue whether it is present or not, but it is the tendency towards incidentality and towards taking an easy option, which often happens to be intergovernmental, and also the tendency to break the established modes of cooperation in order to achieve certain goals, which are very often short-term political gain or actually even PR in some cases. And in my critical reading, this happens at the cost of the EU perceived as EU law perceived as a system, and it threatens to undermine the coherence and integrity of that, as well as values that it is based on, which Jonathan's already started speaking about. In my paper, I have approached the issue from the perspective of authority, which is already a public international law term to address it, since in Europe we are used to speaking of competence or power. In the EU, authority is traditionally strongly connoted with the power to set the rules of the game, and the authority struggle has traditionally been perceived as the one between the EU and the member states. As a point of departure, I present in my paper a brief outline mapping the patterns of distribution of authority in the EU as prescribed by the treaty. So we have the guiding principles of conferral, with the treaty as a source of power, subsidiarity and proportionality. And within the area of powers that are conferred on the EU by the member states, the EU competence is divided in 3 categories. And let me just point out that this categorization is the one that was agreed under the Lisbon Treaty revision, and it's actually an outcome of a certain type of struggle. So that's not been that easy to reach agreement on the division of competences, and the European Court of Justice has played an important role in how those competences were categorized. And as we can imagine, boundaries between those categories are far from clear, and very often areas of activity are under a couple of these competence categories. So we have the exclusive EU competence, the shared competences, and the competence to support, coordinate, or supplement member states' activities. But we also have other categories, including, for example, competence over economic, employment, and social policy. So economic governance is one of those areas where competences to regulate certain issues remain under different categories of competence distribution. So with regards to monetary policy, as Jonathan was saying, it's under the exclusive EU competence, but in its majority, competence is shared between the EU and the member state, with a rather significant area already taken by the EU regulation. It is a heavily regulated area. And of course, competence gets questioned on an everyday basis, but at times of crisis, it's an even more important issue: who owns economic governance and who can take decisions in it. As an occurrence of crisis is a challenge to the legislators and to the system as we see it, and can also be seen as an opportunity, and the whole old notion of never wasting a good crisis made me try and look at what regulatory responses were undertaken during the financial crisis in Europe. A large number of activities, from strategic through legal, institutional, procedural. I made a short list. It's tentative. I don't think anybody in Europe today would dare to say that an exclusive list of those instruments can be made. I looked in particular at two of them, namely the Euro Plus Pact and the Fiscal Compact, because to me these are the two that show the push and pull in the authority area, but are also the two that paint into the picture of more political than legal undertakings. I will not go into much detail now. I will just shortly characterize them. Euro Plus Pact is subtitled Stronger Economic Policy Coordination for Competitiveness and Convergence. There's been a lot of discussion about who should be in, who should be out. Finally, it's Eurozone Plus 6. Its main objectives is to supplement efforts under the economic governance reform at the national level. So its main four areas of application are fostering competitiveness, fostering employment, enhancing stability of public finances, and reinforcing financial stability. And these are actually under the national competence. So from the perspective of authority, the most important distinctive feature of the Euro Plus Pact is that it regulates in the areas that remain under national competence. And of course we can argue what is Euro Plus Pact. It's not hard EU law, it's intergovernmental pact, it's some kind of soft legal mechanism. So everybody says, don't worry, it's voluntary. On the other hand, if you look at the way that Euro Plus Pact is supposed to be implemented, once the state voluntarily signs the Euro Plus Pact, it entails actually a long-term commitment and quite a strong commitment to a set of goals, as well as to accepting the EU influence in monitoring and guiding national policies in those areas. In practice, each participating state has a right to choose the methods in which goals that are agreed on the European level will be achieved, but the choice is guided by the European Commission, and the national programs are being approved at the European level, and their implementation is assessed by the European institutions. So although rhetoric emphasizes the ownership of the pact by the participating states, this ownership is somewhat dubious, because in reality, once you have voluntarily joined, there are credible commitments. And action in sensitive national areas will then now be, to a certain extent, guided, codified, and also monitored by the European Union, which gives an idea of kind of hybrid enforcement of the pact. The second example I looked at is the Fiscal Compact, which illustrates the pull in the opposite direction. So the area which has now so far been largely regulated by the EU has to a certain extent been claimed back by the member states and regulated by them separately in an intergovernmental agreement. And the reason for doing this was lack of unanimous consent to take any other options that have been taken into consideration. We know there were alternatives, we know they were discussed, but there was no unanimity, hence the intergovernmental alternative has been chosen. And this changes a lot, I think. Even if the practical impact of the Fiscal Compact is actually questioned, even though from the point of view of what it regulates and how it regulates, its added value is often doubted. It does show a move in a certain direction, and a direction away from what I think is important in the European legal system. And So from a strict regulatory perspective, it has been argued that most of the provisions that the fiscal compact brings in, and here is the list of the major provisions, it's already either present in the six-pack or is in the process of being adopted. So it seems to be of primarily political or symbolic significance. However, it does not regulate in the vacuum. It has to paint into the larger picture of the economic governance in Europe, and I think that's something we should not lose sight of. Because it does affect the system, and although it remains officially outside the system, it refers to the institutions, it refers to the acquis, which can be questioned both from the point of view of effectiveness as well as from the point of view of legitimacy. And what seems to be more upsetting for me is that even that irrespective of the fact whether the crisis repellent effect of the fiscal compact occurs or does not, the problematic legal and systemic nature of it will remain. And as much as it has a history in the form of the Schengen Agreement that was already mentioned yesterday, which actually from the start had regulated in a different area where the previous balance of competence was a little bit different. What I'm also kind of worried about is that it has continuity, that there is a little bit of starting of a trend of doing things that are not in the canon of what we know as EU law. And we have the ESM, we have the Growth Compact. As a French response to the German austerity, we come up with a Growth Compact, and we are not talking about regulation on growth or directive on growth or any other green paper on growth, things that we know. No, it's a Growth Compact for some reason, and another legal creature that is undefinable. We don't know really what it is. It's a little bit like a declaration of intent, however, put in a form of a compact. And then we have the banking union that we don't know what form it will take, but it will create another union within the union. So we come to the paradoxical situation where we have member states and we have states participating in certain instruments. And of course, as ridiculous as it may sound, or maybe we are sitting here in the room as 27 member states and now you can leave because you're not participating in this instrument. And those of you who are participating can actually participate on different levels. So maybe you have the power to make decisions, but you unfortunately only have the power to be in the room. And this creates many layers of complexity in how the economic governance in Europe functions. So going back to the question of tendency, I think it's not as much a tendency towards intergovernmentalism that is my concern. It's the tendency to take the easy option and to take the strange name game playing. We are making a pact and a compact and a whatever, while we are actually not doing all that much. So that's me being a bit critical. So what are the possible consequences and what I can conclude on it from it? It's firstly, what the turn towards intergovernmentality and this incidentality can do is that it can disturb the continuity of development of European integration process, setting a precedence for fragmentation and easy rejections of procedures that have been established painfully throughout the last decennia. And it entails breaking of a tradition that we have kind of all signed up for. And I'm coming from the member state who we are very happy, but we thought that the EU law is the thing that we sign up for it and it functions. Secondly, it may put into doubt some really fundamental principles and values of European integration and that the European system is based on, such as conferral, unanimity, trust and equality. We've been talking about it since yesterday, so I will not go much into the detail. But I just wanted to emphasize that in an organization where legitimacy is already constructed, playing games with those values of higher importance can actually be a little bit tricky. Thirdly, it puts an end to a simple EU member state divide. We no longer have the power game between the EU and the member state, but we have those different layers of participation in different instruments where one participate or not, and those who participate fully or only participate in a limited way. And it creates room for completely new constellations of conflicts. Finally, I think it seriously decreases the clarity and legal security, and through that, legitimacy of the system, with all the uncertain natures of the pacts and the treaties and the institutions that they create, and the place and the potential relation to the system. I think it complicates additionally an already complicated area, while it does not achieve all that much. Yeah, I think I'll stop now because I think it's time. Thank you.